Why have Republicans been consistently winning?
And even when it seems like they shouldn't be in a position to win. I mean, think about Obama's election. He overwhelmingly won, swept the Electoral College, and right away, Republicans worked within the system to block everything he did, and now all of his policies are being repealed through this president.
It's not like they were breaking the law, but they were certainly gaming the system to take him out.
It's all about changing the norms, isn't it? It's hard to make actual changes to the Constitution and even to laws, but you can always whittle down norms.
My name's Eric Heffinger.
And I'm Soham Manik.
And this is Blue Wave Pod. And on today's episode, we're going to talk to David Ferris, author of It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics.
David Ferris has some particularly interesting ideas that people don't talk about that much. People get caught up in the regular political day-to-day fights, but David is looking at the bigger picture and how Democrats can lock in a progressive majority in the long term.
He's talking about a new Voting Rights Act. He's talking about statehood for D.C. and Puerto Rico, and breaking up California into as many as 7 states, as well as enlarging the Supreme Court.
He's really revisiting fundamental ideas about the American system, from how we vote to how we organize ourselves on a political level. And maybe it's time for that discussion now after 2016.
We'll be right back with author and political scientist David Ferris.
We're here today with David Ferris, who's the author of a new book that just came out. It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics. David, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
It's a very interesting book you've written about what Democrats can do to try to build something that's sustainable and a long-lasting majority. One of the premises of it, which I do want to discuss with you a bit, is about the Constitution itself and the framework that we've set up in this country. It seems like you suggest that as it exists, the constitutional framework, it inherently disfavors progressive politics and policies winning out at the end of the day. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few different reasons. Some of this is original design decisions that took place at the Constitutional Convention. To give one good example, the structure of the U.S. Senate requires that every state have 2 and only 2 U.S. senators, as you know, despite any sort of disparities in population. So, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, we're talking about very small entities, but and I don't think there's any way that they could have foreseen that there'd be 38 million people in California, and those 38 million people would have the same 2 senators as the 700,000 people in Wyoming. And if you look at the U.S. states, all 50 U.S. states, I think what you see is that there's about 29 or 30 Republican-leaning states and probably 20 or 21 Democratic-leaning states. And that creates a real structural bias in the U.S. Senate in terms of the contemporary coalitions of the 2 parties in favor of the Republicans and against the Democrats. And so one of the things I really wanted to do with the book was to look at ways to change that structural imbalance without having to amend the U.S. Constitution, because that's not going to happen. And the Senate is a particular problem because the equal representation is really written into the Constitution with a special provision that says states can't be deprived of it without their consent. So if we want to even things up in the Senate, we have to think creatively about creating new states.
Let's dive into that a little bit. What states would you like to create?
Well, if I was king. But there's, I think the lower hanging fruit right now is Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. These are 2 entities that would be heavily Democratic, if not overwhelmingly Democratic. All of the citizens, they're all U.S. citizens. They're completely deprived of voting representation in Congress. For D.C., that has real implications for the budget. For what happens to people who get sent to prison in D.C., who are sent directly into the federal penitentiary system. And in Puerto Rico, I think we've all seen over the last 6 months the consequences of our leadership not having to answer to the people of Puerto Rico at any time. They've just been completely neglected and very, very ill-served by the current structures. So I think both D.C. and Puerto Rico have held referenda. And this could be, like a month 1 thing the next time Democrats come into power, into total power in D.C. And that would add 4 senators to the Senate. If you think about the situation right now, if D.C. and Puerto Rico were states, the Democrats would already control the Senate. And so we would not have to worry about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's health or really about anything that the Trump administration wanted to do. It would basically be over.
And so on that point, I think it gets to this concept of fighting dirty and what it means, and sort of coupling that with principles that you have that drive your policies. I mean, you mentioned, for example, DC and Puerto Rico not having representation, how that can very negatively affect them. And we see that in Puerto Rico. You're exactly right. They just lost power again last week, right? And no one's doing anything. I guess on a primary note, would you make the same argument on that principle of representation if these were more Republican leaning, and they would be more likely to get the seats? I mean, I guess that gets to the concept of fighting dirty, but how can we make a principled argument if we're doing it just for partisan purposes?
Sure. I mean, I think that in these two cases, we have both morality on our side and we also have partisanship on our side. I don't think that there's any defense of this arrangement from a small d democratic perspective. In other words, having hundreds of thousands or millions of American citizens with no voting representation in our national legislature, even if these were Republican territories, I would support statehood for them. I don't know if I would support it as a month one project for the next Democratic majority.
Right.
I would definitely support it in theory, and if it happened, I wouldn't complain, because I don't think that people should be American citizens and not have a congressman or congressperson or a senator to vote for. I think it's absurd. A lot of the things in the book are, we talk about them as fighting dirty. I think of it more as procedural hardball, and doing things to sort of pushing the boundaries of the constitutional order to benefit Democrats. But I don't recommend doing things that I think are really unethical, like deliberately depriving people of the right to vote if they don't agree with us or something like that.
Well, that leads into a big fight that we're from Ohio, and right now we're fighting gerrymandering. What is your stance on that? Should Democrats utilize that, or should we get rid of that?
Well, I mean, I'm against gerrymandering, and I applaud these efforts that are taking place at the state level to institute nonpartisan redistricting commissions and all that kind of stuff. I think there's a lot of energy on the left to fix this problem, and I find that really heartening. While I applaud what you're doing, I also think that there is a national fix for this problem. And that national fix is to eliminate these battles about gerrymandering, like from the face of the earth altogether, by changing the way that we vote for the House. And that's another thing that's not in the Constitution. The Constitution says, that the House should exist, that it should be reelected every 2 years. But it doesn't say anything about how the district should be drawn. And so there's an organization called Fair Vote outside of DC, and they have a plan to create larger districts. So instead of a single member, one person district, 435 separate elections for the House, what we would have is 3 or 5 member districts, and they would be elected by ranked choice voting. So that would allow people to vote their hearts. It might invite third or fourth parties into the process. And Fair Vote, they actually hired a data wizard to try to gerrymander these 3 or 5 person districts, and they couldn't do it. And it would really be magical because if we don't have to fight about the district lines anymore, then we can stop these lawsuits. It doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says about the Wisconsin map. We wouldn't have to fight this battle like state by state, like we're taking back the islands in the Pacific in the Second World War, like one bloody battle at a time. I think there's a national solution for this problem. And I also recommend in the book doubling the size of the House. To kind of bring the size of that body more in line with what the framers intended. And that would allow us to have 5 or 10 member districts. And what we know from the political science about this system is that the larger the districts, the more proportional the outcomes. In other words, you'd have a better fit between the votes that are cast and the seats that are held. And you'd be unlikely to have a situation like we've had here twice recently where, in 2016, Republicans won the national vote for the House by one single point, and they emerged with this enormous majority. And then 2012, Democrats won the national vote for the House, and yet Republicans again had a majority. Not just because of gerrymandering, but because it's actually very hard to draw the district lines in a fair way right now, given the way Democrats and Republicans are clustered in different areas of each state.
You said you were against gerrymandering, and I want to come back to your statehood ideas. One of your ideas is to break up California. Wouldn't that be a form of gerrymandering to say, like, yeah, we could break this into 6 or 7 different states to try to get us those Democratic voters specifically?
I mean, yeah, you can think of it. I mean, you can imagine a scenario where this leads to a kind of a tit for tat breaking up of a number of states. But I think I could defend this proposal both morally and strategically in the sense that we have so much sort of progressive energy bottled up in California right now. And I think that there's a real case to be made that it's too big, that we could have 14 U.S. senators coming out of California rather than 2. Like, we wouldn't have to fight about whether Dianne Feinstein is going to get reelected. And I think that there is a sense in which a lot of people in California have always been dissatisfied with the level of control exerted by Sacramento over the rest of the state. There's been repeated efforts to break up California. I mean, going all the way back to the 1850s when California emerged as a U.S. state. There was a movement even then to have 2 states, Southern California and Northern California.
And if the Dakotas get it, why can't California get it?
Exactly. I mean, I think it's important to remember that the way that the states got their shapes was very, very much a process of happenstance. This was not a carefully plotted set of 50 states. You know what I mean? It was like people rushing westward and putting down stakes and saying like, hey, Congress, like, we want to be a state now. And I don't think that any sensible person would sit down and design the 50 states the way that they are designed currently. I think you would obviously want to have much more balance between the population numbers than you do at the present time. So I think of it less as gerrymandering and more like rectifying a huge problem in our politics. And that is that everyone in California, because of the size of California, is massively disadvantaged in terms of their voting power vis-a-vis somebody in Wyoming or the Dakotas or even a blue state like Vermont or Delaware. Has much, much more power in our national politics than California does. And so I think that there's a real sort of small d Democratic case to be made that California is much, much too big in the context of our system. And I think, we can worry about whether then Texas would do the same, but I would argue that almost all Republican-leaning states are, you might call them indivisible, in the sense that almost every Republican state has a large metropolitan area, or at least one, that leans heavily Democratic, and that by splitting up that state, it would be a wash. You could cut Texas in half, you could cut it into 3 or 4 or 5, and it's very hard for me to see how that would help them, because you would be creating Democratic states in their wake. And I drew these maps in California that all 7 of these states would have voted for Hillary Clinton, even Orange County, which hadn't voted for a Democrat since 1936. So it's the most left-wing large state in the country. And I think that its power really needs to be unleashed in our national politics. Obviously, that's going to take more than, that's not a month one project.
Right. It's interesting when you talk about the sort of why that needs to occur, right? When you talk about Vermont and the power they have. I mean, obviously, this is a discussion that was at the forefront of when the Constitution was drafted, right? And the compromise of having senators. So at the end of the day, it really gets down to the basis of why the Constitution is the way it is, right? And I love the thought exercise of trying to figure out ways to play within the constitutional norms and still make it work. But I want to get back to that base question of why do you think it's so difficult these days to even propose an amendment? And why would breaking up a state into 7 states seem more realistic than amending the Constitution when we have a process in place for that, right? I mean, we've amended it enough times now in our history where we know how it works. It's not like we've never touched it, but it seems like these days that never even comes up as a topic. We hear it sometimes with campaign finance, maybe. Obviously, the Republicans bring it up with flag burning sometimes and those types of things. But why are we so afraid to revisit it and have that conversation in this country?
I mean, I don't think we're afraid of it. I mean, I think there's a few things going on here. One is that the architects of the Constitution, I think that they could have foreseen a politics that's polarized like ours is right now, where, people from the 2 parties can barely be seen having breakfast together without getting primaried in the next election. And because they set the bar so high to amend the Constitution, I mean, you're right that there's a process that we've gone through, 27 times now, but the bar is really, really high. There's 2/3 majorities in the House and Senate, and then 3/4 of the states have to pass the amendment. And so in the current partisan context, what you really need is you have to identify a problem where the solution has broad bipartisan appeal, and it would be perceived as having nonpartisan impact, if that makes sense. So, because Republicans are so attached at this point to the consequences of Citizens United, because these billionaires have become so important in bankrolling the individual Republican candidates and these sort of state level efforts like ALEC, it's sort of inconceivable to me that you could convince enough Republican-leaning states to pass that amendment that it would get through in our current politics. And so to amend the Constitution to fix a problem that would have partisan impact, you have to imagine this like monumental wave scenario where Democrats take these like overwhelming majorities in Congress and control 3/4 of the state legislatures. And I just, I'm an optimistic person, but I just don't, I don't see that happening,
Well, I guess to me at least, it seems like a question of political efficacy at the end of the day, right? I mean, I agree it's difficult to sort of flip all of those houses, especially state houses, and trying to make that work. But isn't that the way the system's set up to work slowly? Isn't that the way it just should be done? And that's why we've set it up that way. I mean, the idea of doing these, say you break up California into 6 or 7 different states, right? You're essentially going to piss off a bunch of people in those states and probably have people lose more faith in the government than, obviously it can be at an all-time low now if we think about it. But how do you keep that trust in the government with all citizens if you don't go through the process in place and try to sidestep it?
I think obviously in California, you need the buy-in of Californians. So the Constitution would allow it, but I certainly would not recommend that the California state legislature do this without a referendum. So I think that if you get significant support out of the state of California to break up California, then I think that the repercussions would be somewhat more limited than they would be if you did this without people's consent, which I really obviously would not recommend doing. So that
it's starting the conversation, really.
Right, exactly. It's like if somebody in California picks up this book and they see this proposal and they're like, "Oh, dude, no, hard pass," really, what I hope to achieve with the book is to get people thinking about the ways that California is so disadvantaged in our national politics, and that if we did this, it would allow the California model to have much more of a fighting chance at the national level of succeeding.
2 of your other big ideas are enlarging the Supreme Court and a new Voting Rights Act. Can you go into a little bit of detail on what you would like to do with these things?
Sure. Yeah. Let me take the second one first. For the voting rights, which is since the turn of this century, what we have seen is Republicans embarking on a deliberate project to drive down Democratic turnout by changing laws that are constitutional, but that I think represent a violation not just of democratic norms, but of democratic legitimacy in theory. So some of those things are like restricting early voting hours in places like Florida or North Carolina. Some of those things are these voter ID laws that were passed in pretty cookie-cutter fashion, starting with the Bush administration. And the impact has been pretty stark. We also are the only democratic country in the world that in which in many states former felons can never vote again. So in Florida alone, there's 1.6 million people who are disenfranchised by these felony voting laws. And we saw in Virginia last year in November the power that Democrats can seize by restoring the voting rights of ex-felons. So what I envision is a national voting rights act. The elections clause of the Constitution very clearly gives Congress the right to set procedures and laws for federal elections. And because federal and state elections are run concurrently in most cases, a national voting rights act would effectively legislate for both federal and state elections. And so it's another case where there's a lot of great work being done at the state level for things like automatic voter registration, and things like challenging felony disenfranchisement laws and fighting back against gerrymandering. But it's another place where there is a very sort of easy national solution to this problem, and that is a Democratic Congress acting in concert with a Democratic president, sort of wiping a lot of these problems from the face of the earth in the first few months of a new administration with a national law. And that national law would include automatic voter registration. So we create an opt-out system instead of an opt-in system where you have to navigate a complex bureaucracy to get the right to vote in the first place. It would include a national election holiday so that the Tuesday federal elections in this country would be a federal holiday. And because most countries have either weekend voting or they vote on a holiday, like they set aside the weekday as a holiday. It would eliminate, restore the voting rights of all ex-felons in the United States immediately, with the wave of a wand. I'd go further and say not to deprive those people of the right to vote in the first place, but I recognize that might be a non-starter in our politics. And then, of course, it would eliminate these voter ID laws and just declare them unconstitutional. It's another case where it's the right thing to do, right? Like these are all things that any advanced democratic country should be doing, that is making it easier for people to vote rather than harder for people to vote. And it would also, I think, have very important impact for Democrats as a national party and their ability to win elections in a lot of these places.
It's always kind of funny how just increasing access to voting somehow becomes a progressive policy when it should be just a common sense type of thing, really.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And, the Republicans are the only party in the advanced democratic world that has decided their way to stay in power is to prevent other people from voting, and it's really disgusting. And it's why I feel perfectly justified in making the recommendations I do in this book, because it's not just that it would help Democrats, it's that it would help bolster the democratic legitimacy of all American elections if we had more people voting and more people participating. Because we also have one of the lowest turnout rates in the democratic world, too. So there's all kinds of problems with our democracy that are amenable to these constitutional fixes that are within the framework, right? They don't require amendments. They're things that majorities could do if they could find the will to act in concert. So let's talk about the Supreme Court, too. So this is the most controversial part of the book, I think.
It's probably the dirtiest trick if we had to write one, right?
Yeah, if I were to rank the levels of dirtiness of this book, this would be at the top.
Well, FDR tried this and failed at it.
Yeah, he did. But I think that most people don't remember that it wasn't like a constitutional problem with FDR's proposal. He had a political problem in that his congressional allies didn't want to go along with it. And then I think the very threat of court packing then led a couple of justices on the Supreme Court to kind of soften their thinking about key aspects of the New Deal, so that he eventually didn't feel like he had to do it at all. But it's also important to remember, and there's a little bit of a sort of narrative about this in the book, is that FDR wanted to add so many justices that it was a non-starter, but Congress was actually willing to go along with versions of that law that would have added 2 or 3 justices to the court. So it's not that any court enlargement scheme was deemed unacceptable. It was like the particular one that FDR decided he really needed in order to get the New Deal platform passed was just too much. It was like a bridge too far. But I think if we step back and look at the court wars in broader perspective over the last 25 years, we'll see that we have a real problem in American politics. And again, this is the theme of the book, is we have a small d democratic problem and we have a big D democratic problem. The big D democratic problem is that the Democrats have won the popular vote for the presidency in 6 of the last presidential elections. If it wasn't for the Electoral College, like under any sane electoral system, we would already have a majority on the Supreme Court. And I went further and I added up all of the votes for the U.S. Senate since 1992. And Democrats have won 30 million more votes for the U.S. Senate in those elections. And so if you take those two things together, those are the 2 institutions that make appointments to the federal judiciary. And the American people have spoken very clearly that they want the Democratic Party to appointing living constitutionalists to the Supreme Court, and that's not what happened. And Republicans have really escalated these court battles by. Between 2009 and 2013, they blocked more nominees to the federal judiciary than had ever been blocked in the history of the United States. And that led to the elimination of the filibuster by the Democrats for these lower court nominees.
Do you think that was a good decision by the Democrats?
I think, to be honest with you, I think that Republicans would have done what they did in 2016 anyway. And so, yeah, I do think it was a good decision, because if they hadn't done that, President Trump would probably be able to fill double the number of lower court seats that he already has a lot of seats to fill on the judiciary, and I think he'd have a lot more, to the point where he could flip control of a lot of these appellate and district courts just in his first term alone, which would be very unusual. So I would defend that move as a response to Republican escalation of these normative understandings, because here's another place where the constitutional framework is too vague to be helpful to us. And that's that the Republicans were right in 2016 when they said, look, the Constitution does not actually require us to consider the nomination of Merrick Garland. Right? It's a
I think one thing we've learned since 2016, which has, I think, surprised a lot of people, is a lot of what we've done and how we've run things are based on norms and not based in any law or constitution, right? And
absolutely.
So do you think it's time to revisit those norms now? Or do we think, it seems like as they erode, particularly with this president, people are getting concerned that, like when they think about what's actually the backstop, there isn't one really.
Right. No, exactly. I mean, so much of our politics depends on informal understandings between the political actors. that kind of fill in the gaps where the Constitution is not clear. And so while I do recommend what I like to call enhanced judicial nomination techniques rather than court packing, I actually do think that Democrats should offer a truce before they get to the court packing stage. And that truce would have a number of components. The first and most important would be to eliminate lifetime tenure on the Supreme Court. There's an organization in DC. So for every chapter of this book, there's like an organization that works on this thing. And that organization is called Fix the Court. And they have a law that they've proposed that would cap service on the Supreme Court at 18 years. That would give every president the right to make 2 Supreme Court appointments every 4 years. And it would routinize these procedures so that they didn't become these life and death battles where we appoint, 40-something-year-old legal Doogie Howsers to the Supreme Court to sit there until they die, when the rest of us are approaching retirement. I think that those procedures have become incredibly destructive because our political actors correctly perceive the long-term importance of every single nomination to the judiciary, especially but not limited to the Supreme Court. So I think that we should offer, we should say, like, this is what we're going to do if you say no to this. But we would actually like to amend the Constitution to eliminate lifetime tenure on the courts. And that's another thing, just like eliminating gerrymandering, that I think would have really magical consequences for the temperature and the tenor of our politics.
You said your day one initiative is DC Puerto Rico statehood, but most of this other stuff we talked about is very long term. I'm really curious, with the blue wave that they plan to initiate here, what should they be running on to get elected and then initiate after 2018?
Well, I think that the future of the Democratic Party right now, I think the center, the sort of ideological center of the party is moving left pretty rapidly, just in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think equality and fairness is a really powerful way to look at some of the problems that we have in American society. So I think that, we need a national message about fairness, about inequality, about the way that the Republican Party in particular seems to have no other purpose right now other than sort of transferring wealth upwards. And they're so incompetent right now that I think, like, you can have an imperfect message and still win in 2018 and 2020. But in the long run, I think the party really needs a coherent agenda to fight and win elections and to appeal to as many people as possible. The point of the book is like that's not enough. Like, we can have the right policies, and there's still going to be people that are outraged by them, and that we need to give ourselves a better chance to win multiple elections in a row by changing some of the rules. Like, we don't need to win every single time. But we can't keep losing elections that we've actually won if we want to have a progressive country.
Right. And it's also just a great time to fundamentally question some things that I think we just take as a given a lot of times in this country. So thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating ideas in a very fascinating book. Again, it's called It's Time to Fight Dirty, How Democrats Can Build a Lasting Majority in American Politics by David Ferris. And thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me on the show. It was a blast.
I've got to be honest, I don't disagree with anything that he's saying, and I don't think it's actually playing that dirty.
No, it's interesting he calls it fighting dirty, but it seems like everything is still based in some type of principle. You're not just doing it just to win.
Yeah, a lot of what he was saying was giving reasons on how to go out to the voters and say, this is why we should do this activity. Not just because I want to solidify my Democratic majority, but because we should do this.
And really it gets to the broader point, right? We need to have this conversation more. We can't just keep working in this system that is inherently unfair on multiple levels. And Democrats can lead that charge.
Republicans are definitely going out of their way to disenfranchise voters, right? They're going out of their way to make sure that they get the vote by gerrymandering or saying you can't vote unless you have an ID or any of those things. We can change that. We can empower people to get out to the polls and become part of this democratic process.
We can, and we should have that discussion about the system of government we want. That conversation is not done.
A lot of the political talk right now is about the immediacy of how to harness and control Donald Trump, right? But to get the voters out there, we may need to start talking about what we're going to do in 5 years, 10 years, right? What is the roadmap, and why should you vote for a Democratic majority? What are we going for? And some of these things that he talks about are policies that I think can really engage the Democratic base to get out there in presidential years and midterm years.
It's a bold vision, and that's what we need today more than ever. So thank you for listening. You can always find us at our website, bluewavepod.com, and on Facebook or Twitter at bluewavepod.